Trump being such a transactional politician, the way they need to frame it is not just simply this is wrong, this is bad, this is naughty, which has a tendency to be particularly the kind of rhetoric we get from Brussels. But instead, if you want us to do X, Y, and Z, particularly in terms of the reconstruction and the securing of Ukraine after a deal, then we need to be involved in the process, and these are our red lines. It requires a degree of, a combination of subtlety and brutality, which we'll have to see if Europe can manage.
President Trump has offered few details on what, if anything, has changed in his months-long effort to bring about a deal, but he said any discussions would involve some swapping of territory, which, as you're hearing there, is a controversial prospect. President Zelenskyy of Ukraine this morning says he will not give land to those whom he calls the occupier, and that any solutions that exclude Ukraine are against peace. Meanwhile, it's reported that officials from the US, Ukraine, Europe and the UK are expected to meet today in London to try to forge a united front ahead of that meeting in Alaska. Mark Galeotti is a Russia expert and director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence. Good morning, Mark.
Hello there.
First of all, your take on the fact that this meeting seems to be going ahead in Alaska next Friday. Just analyse that for us.
Well, it's interesting that this is moving at, by the standards of summits, a ludicrous speed. Again, usually there's huge amounts of preparation in advance, and this is clearly something that worries not just the Ukrainians, but a lot of people in the United States. Putin would probably have loved to have actually had the meeting in Russia, but, Alaska seems in many ways the next best thing. It is on American soil, which is, a slight little sort of concession to Trump. He likes to feel he's on home territory, and from Putin's point of view, that's no problem. But also it's a reminder of the fact that there are many parts of the world that were mooted as potential places to meet, where actually Putin couldn't have gone without running the risk of having the International Criminal Court arrest warrant, which is out in his name for war crimes, being sort of presented to him. But of course, the United States has not signed up to the founding treaty. So in some ways, it's also from the Russians' point of view, a little sly dig at the whole structures of international law, which are being sort of mobilized against him by saying, look, we don't care about them, and nor do the Americans.
Yes, that's a very good point, actually, that there's an agreement on that. You mentioned the ludicrous speed. If we consider some of the chronology of this, it's reported today in the Wall Street Journal that Trump's announcement of the Alaska summit, in which he also talked about these land swaps, follows the presentation of Putin, or by Putin, of a deal, a proposal for a ceasefire in Ukraine, which demanded major territorial concessions by Ukraine. And this is going to be a huge issue, as President Zelenskyy has highlighted already this morning, Mark.
It is, though we should realise that there's a difference between actually recognising, so to say, the realities on the ground de facto and recognising new international borders. I mean, I don't think at the moment there's any question of saying these territories that Russia has occupied, they are now legally Russian under international law. That's not something that Trump could give. It's not something that, as you've heard, Zelenskyy could give without having to rewrite the entire Ukrainian constitution, which would mean a referendum. Instead, it's more or less an acceptance of lines on the map as the current de facto borders, even though the question of legal right can be punted off into the future. But I think there's one point that's really worth mentioning is that we're very much having to deal off a variety of rumours being floated, usually by sort of sources who don't give their names. And what's clear is there is a battle going on inside the White House or inside the administration, as both Russia hawks and, I won't say Russia doves, but certainly sort of more of a peacemaking community, each try and push their line. Because first we had this claim from an unnamed White House source that Trump wouldn't meet Putin unless he met Zelenskyy first. And then that was denied. So, I think in some ways there is not a fixed plan at this stage. Yeah. There is still a guerrilla war going on within the administration to try and push Trump in different directions.
I'm intrigued by, we'll come back to the guerrilla war, and I think actually that potentially means there's an opening for the Europeans. Let's come back to that in a second. What you talk about there, this kind of acceptance of de facto borders, isn't that a huge concession to Putin? That in a few years' time, come back and push a bit harder and see where the borders end up that time?
It is, and that's why the crucial point is precisely what guarantees Ukraine will have afterwards. And I think this is the thing. We can focus on, rightly, the particular terms of whatever deal that Trump and Putin may or may not be able to hammer out. But in any case, the issue is absolutely how do these new terms and new ceasefire get monitored properly? I don't think actually this sort of notion of the coalition of the willing that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have been pushing will work there. How can Ukraine be secured properly, precisely so that this isn't just a breathing space? So I think that's an entire issue. And this is why whatever happens on Friday, it's the start of the process, not the end. And Ukraine will need to be secured, protected, guaranteed, and indeed encouraged to think that it's not being abandoned.
On the sort of question, I suppose, of whether the de facto lines are accepted, electorally, that Zelenskyy would be toast at that point, wouldn't he? The people of Ukraine potentially would not be on board with that if he was to make that decision.
I mean, it's a tricky one because most recent polling from Gallup has shown, in fact, that now a majority of Ukrainians favour, some kind of early negotiations to achieve peace. Now, that is not necessarily the same as making concessions. But I think what we have seen is definitely there has been a shifting of the centre of gravity in Ukrainian politics. But that said, look, politics is a rough game. And in many ways, we're stacking ifs upon ifs, but if, in fact, this was the deal, and if Zelenskyy was expected to swallow it, just simply as the price of continuing to have any kind of American support, then I wouldn't be surprised if, in many ways, this would be his last heroic act of self-sacrifice in the name of his country.
Wow.
Because probably even a lot of Ukrainians who would be delighted that the war is over and the sort of the conscription has ended and so forth, but would nonetheless almost sort of punish him as their scapegoat as a result.
Wow.
So, it very much depends on quite what Zelenskyy is willing to do.
Let's return then to that idea of a guerrilla war in the administration and no real solid plan as to what this summit really will discuss and what the outcomes may be. Does that, Mark, leave an opportunity actually for the Europeans to have something of a say in influencing what that plan could and should be?
In theory, yes. The problem is, of course, how do you actually make that traction sort of count? I mean, otherwise, from the Europeans' point of view, they're going to find themselves in a very tough position. Do they actually repudiate a potential deal between Trump and Putin, which will probably wash away all the work that has been done of late and all, to be perfectly honest, the sort of the fawning treatment of Trump in order precisely to try and keep Trump engaged with and positive towards Europe? Or do they go along with it, in which case they more or less kind of validate this notion, which is already present in much of the world, that actually Europe as a continent and certainly the European Union are not really serious geopolitical actors. So I think at this stage, they need to be sort of moving in. And in particular, Trump being such a transactional politician, the way they need to frame it is not just simply this is wrong, this is bad, this is naughty, which has a tendency to be particularly the kind of rhetoric we get from Brussels. But instead, if you want us to do X, Y, and Z, particularly in terms of the reconstruction and the securing of Ukraine after a deal, then we need to be involved in the process, and these are our red lines. It requires a degree of, a combination of subtlety and brutality, which we'll have to see if Europe can manage.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much. Thanks for your insight and analysis and clarity in the midst of uncertainty as we try to pin down exactly what's going on here. That is Mark Galeotti, Russia expert and director of the MAYAC Intelligence Consultancy.